So now it's a great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Vanessa Levesque. I first met Vanessa when she began working on her PhD right here at the University of Maine. She focused in a broad sense on how to help communities balance some complex trade-offs associated with community and economic development on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. When she came to start her PhD here, she already had a lot of experience as a natural resource planner at both the municipal and the state level in Maine. So she moves easily between the academic world and the wider world. She's steeped in the science of sustainability, and she's focused on using that knowledge to help strengthen the resilience of rural communities. Resilience in the face of pandemics, climate change, and many other challenges. Beginning nearly 2 years ago, she played many leadership roles in an innovative collaboration involving multiple universities across northern New England to examine the potential effects of climate migration on the economic, social, cultural, and environmental future of the region. That's what she's going to talk about today. And I'm particularly grateful that she crafted such a provocative title, Maine Vacationland or Climate Migrationland. Please join me in welcoming Vanessa Levesque.
Thank you so much, David, for that lovely introduction. I am really happy to be here and to be a part of this speaker series. Let me just share my screen here. I can't talk. So I'm going to actually start out this presentation by admitting something pretty huge. Despite my good old French-Canadian last name, I am not a Mainer. Yep, that's right. My paternal grandfather was from Maine and my children were born here, but I cannot make that claim. We don't know a lot about my family's history, but I do know that my paternal grandmother was from Thetford Mines, Quebec, and that my grandparents were part of an extended migration of French Canadians to Connecticut to work in the abundant factories and mills of the time. They settled in New Britain, Connecticut, where my grandmother's two brothers ended up opening a local pub, which I'm told was successful until the state put a highway in through my family's neighborhood, causing them to move again, this time involuntarily. And my father mostly grew up in what he calls the projects. I bring up this story to remind us all that migration is not a new phenomenon. People have been moving away from the places they love or don't to new homes with hopes for a fresh start for as long as we've been on Earth. Further, these past migrations have often disadvantaged Indigenous, Black, and low-income people. Thus, it is within this context that we explore the idea that climate change is now among the drivers of migration, and that Maine could see a steady increase in population growth due to this migration. Today's talk will be an exploration of these ideas and their potential implications. Let's start off by thinking about what climate migration is. So, the International Organization for Migration says that it is the movement of a person or groups of persons who, predominantly for reasons of sudden or progressive change in the environment due to climate change, are obliged to leave their habitual place of residence or choose to do so either temporarily or permanently within a state or across an international border. Phew, there's a lot in that definition, so let's unpack it a little bit. First, climate migration can be for reasons of sudden or progressive change in the environment due to climate change. These two conditions are often called sudden or rapid onset climate conditions or slow onset climate conditions, and I'll be referring to those two terms throughout this talk. Rapid onset events are things like hurricanes or forest fires. Their impending arrival is only known for days ahead of time. Slow onset events are things like drought and sea level rise that happen over many years. There tends to be a fairly direct link between rapid onset extreme weather events and the displacement of people. And these migrants tend to stay closer to the places they've left behind, although not always. Meanwhile, the connection between climatic conditions and migration are less obvious when the climate change have had a slow onset. In addition, people who leave their homes quickly tend to have much different needs than those who have taken some time to plan a move. Related, there is also a spectrum of how voluntary someone's move away from their home is. Residents can be under a mandatory evacuation orders during a rapid onset event, or it can be a slow onset condition such as sea level rise may become so extreme that a home is no longer reasonably livable. Again, the needs of people who move involuntarily may be quite different, especially if those people are already disadvantaged in other ways. Another important part of this definition is that people may move to a new place temporarily or permanently. And in fact, research indicates that people may move multiple times in their process of migration. Again, as we think about what migrants might need in this process, whether or not they are moving temporarily will make a difference. Finally, people can move within a country, which is called internal migration, or they can move internationally. Even internal migration varies from movements to a different location within the same county or to the other side of the country. Currently, it is thought that most climate migrants are moving internally. Some suggest that is going to change as climate change intensifies, but we just don't have the data yet to say if that's the case. One particular type of migration that we might end up seeing here in Maine is called managed retreat. Managed retreat is the planned and purposeful relocation of people and buildings away from climate risks. The reason I am belaboring this definition is partly to expand whatever conception you had of a climate migrant. The term encompasses people from a wide range of places, social classes, climate experiences, timelines, and so on. And this will greatly impact how we think about what we need to do to prepare for climate migrants in Maine. It is also important to keep in mind during my talk that how and whether people move is shaped by many factors, including an individual household's resources and networks, as well as by government preparations. Even within the US, we see migration patterns based on race and class. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, those with the least resources, networks, and government support were trapped in New Orleans. And the recovery and return process was far more lengthy for Black New Orleans than it was for white residents. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. First, let's look a little more at what we know about why people move. Migration researchers have identified economic, social, and environmental factors that drive migration. Even for a seemingly straightforward impact, such as perhaps sea level rise, where direct inundation forces displacement of someone, research finds that whether and how people migrate depends significantly on a diversity of socioeconomic and cultural factors. Migration responses will vary depending on the nature of the environmental threat, the development context, a household or community's knowledge, networks, resources, and values. Migration researchers have identified both push and pull factors in drivers of migration. Push factors are the things in a person's home environment that motivate them to leave, while pull factors are characteristics of the place where they are going that attract them to it. Some examples of economic push factors would be a lack of job opportunities or a high cost of living where someone is, whereas economic pull factors might be better job opportunities, housing availability, or investment opportunities. Example of social push factors could be discrimination or conflict, whereas social pull factors in a place where someone's moving to might be an improved quality of life or amenities or the presence of family or friends in the area. Finally, it's in the environmental push factors that we might see an increase of natural disasters or climate hazards pushing someone out of the way. Or more recently, we saw this with the COVID-19 infection rates, where environmental pull factors might be milder climates, natural amenities, or again with COVID, a less populated area. There's usually an interplay of economic, social, and environmental factors driving a household's decision to move. Research in climate-stressed areas finds that many people do not want to migrate, even if their livelihoods are at risk. And those who do move rarely cite environmental factors as the primary motivations for leaving. For instance, a 2021 report by the World Food Program, the Migration Policy Institute, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology found that in an area of Central America plagued by severe drought and food insecurity, only 6% of respondents said they were motivated to move because of those climate and environment reasons. The vast majority cited economic drivers. When climate change occurs gradually, environmental stresses are interwoven with other drivers of migration, so that it becomes very difficult to say who is a climate migrant and who is migrating for other reasons. Further, each household is willing to deal with different amounts of climate risk before they reach a threshold that causes them to move. Those thresholds are likely related to that household's economic and social situations. In sum, we know the basic drivers of human migration, but in terms of the impact of climate change, there's still a lot to understand about if and how different combinations of climate-related factors contribute to movement decisions. By now, you should be getting the idea that climate migration is complex. How people move or do not move in response to climate hazards is as mixed and messy as migration has always been. The numbers of current, never mind predicted future climate migrants, is very imprecise. To further complicate things, there is no legal basis for the definition of a climate migrant or climate refugee. No government currently offers a legal migration pathway based solely on an individual's exposure to climate change. And the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has made clear that fleeing the impacts of climate change is not sufficient grounds for receiving refugee status, which is limited to people escaping persecution. Some climate migration reports highlight the worst case scenarios of climate migrants to galvanize action on climate change. These more extreme analyses tend to equate the total number of people living in areas threatened by climate with the number of future climate migrants. This neglects the potential for different measures like building seawalls or using air conditioning that might keep people in place. It also neglects the reality that some people lack the resources to move, while others might just be moving anyhow. In addition, as I've just mentioned, migration requires significant resources, including money, networks, and know-how. The most vulnerable groups, those with low levels of income and education, the elderly, or those with disabilities, are more likely to be left exposed to the continued impacts of climate change. Thus, it's suggested that rather than attempt to identify exactly who is or is not a climate migrant, or how many exactly there are, researchers might instead focus on policy and humanitarian responses for both those who move due to climate stressors and those who can't. Okay, let's start looking at where climate migrants move to. Most research on climate migration in North America has focused on the process of moving away, with minimal analysis of the places where newcomers would settle. These places where people go are called the receiver communities. Most climate migration is projected to remain within a country's borders, the internal migration, but cross-border international migration will also rise. Historically, cities have been the prime destination for climate migrants, but whether or not that trend continues is currently under question. Some researchers have studied where climate migrants have gone after rapid onset events, such as Hurricane Katrina. However, as we discussed, those who leave after rapid onset events are more likely to stay closer to home, to move multiple times, and or to return back to their original homes. Thus, in order to figure out where people may go after multiple moves or due to slow onset climate change impacts, most researchers are using migration models. Quantifying climate migration is challenging given the multiple drivers of such movement, methodological challenges, and the lack of data. Some quantitative data exists on population displacement due to extreme weather events. However, for migration due to slow onset environmental processes such as drought or sea level rise, most existing data are qualitative and based on case studies. So as I just mentioned, some researchers are creating models, and these usually use past migration data. The past migration data movement patterns are usually based more on the economic and social factors than on climate. For example, Matt Hauer focuses on modeling migration due to sea level rise in the US. The map shown here is based on a combination of 40 years of past migration data, flood hazard models, and population models in order to project how population might change in the US counties due to sea level rise. In this map, the red and orange counties will be losing population due to sea level rise. Blue counties will be gaining population, and white counties will have no projected change in population. This modeling is interesting because they take into account that climate migration has historically occurred more often among young working age adults. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, people over 70 were the least likely to evacuate New Orleans. In addition, this model includes a demographic feedback loop whereby climate migration affects the population trajectory over time. So for example, younger climate migrants could start families in their new destination, and the fertility shift in that population could further increase the population by drawing in needed doctors, construction workers, engineers, waiters, etc. However, like all models, this map has its limitations. This particular map that I'm showing you is just one of many, but this one is based only on migration due to sea level rise, not any other climate impacts. And it looks at long-term population trends, what would happen by 2100, rather than any shorter-term movements. The value of maps like these lie less in the particulars that you're looking at and more in the general patterns and possibilities that might guide planning processes. Another way to look at where climate migrants will move is to categorize potential receiving areas more broadly. In the research I'm showing here now, they distribute communities along a gradient of small rural towns to large urban centers and from growing to shrinking communities. They then suggest that there can be receiving communities within each quadrant. Shown in green, the small rural gateways are rural destinations that are already popular for their natural amenities, and the large inland gateways are metropolitan areas that have typically served as immigrant centers. These are both gateway communities to symbolize that they are likely to attract newcomers based on their current characteristics, making them de facto recipient communities. Shown in orange, the rural interiors are smaller rural towns with minimal investment And the legacy cities are older industrial communities that have experienced population and economic decline. These can both become more explicit recipient communities if they choose to pursue the economic growth opportunity presented by incoming migrants. While these places could potentially benefit from migration, there are some complexities to take into consideration. For example, tensions between newcomers and existing residents could form, especially when residents from these areas already feel overlooked by their governments. In addition, smaller towns may need to provide new infrastructure to grow their communities, requiring financial investments. And these communities may need to increase the capacity of their local governance structures, neither of which is quick or easy to come by. Okay, all of this discussion so far leads us to ask if climate migrants are coming to Maine, and if so, where specifically? As I've suggested, I don't have a good answer for you. It's really difficult to know. There's no definition of a climate migrant that has legal meaning to help us know if people are coming internationally due to climate drivers. And internal migrants coming to Maine for climate reasons haven't been explicitly studied yet. I'd love to. However, we have reason to believe that many receiving communities could exist in Maine. We saw an increase in people coming to Maine during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when there was an increase of over 30,000 people moving here. There are several studies that model likely climate migration destinations, like the map we viewed from Matt Hauer and colleagues, which identify inland areas of Maine as being likely receiving areas. Other studies have tracked where people moved after recent hurricanes. After Hurricane Maria, for example, over 56,000 Puerto Ricans relocated to Florida, but the next largest shares of evacuees actually landed in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and some even landed in Maine. We can perhaps learn from a recent study in Vermont, where Cheryl Morse, a researcher at the University of Vermont, surveyed about 30 people who moved to that state from different parts of the US since the start of the pandemic. She found that at least a third of those surveyed included climate in their decisions to relocate, citing factors such as water shortages and wildfires. However, Vermont's new arrivals were also driven by a desire to reduce exposure to COVID-19 and by relatively inexpensive homes compared to the more pricey areas from which they came. Hence, as expected, migration decisions were driven by a range of economic, social, and environmental factors, and they likely are as well for people who are moving to Maine. The popular media has also highlighted some examples of people who moved to Maine due to climate change impacts in their former homes. For example, a recent Maine Biz story reported on a couple that moved from California to Maine to retire to get away from the increased risk of forest fires in their prior home. So in sum, people have already started moving away from areas in the US that are highly impacted by climate change, and some of them have likely moved to Maine. How many and the degree to which this will continue is unknown. The uncertainty increases when we recall that migration is not only driven by push factors, but also by pull factors in the receiving areas. What Maine towns and cities do today will likely influence the degree to which they pull in new climate migrants in the coming decades. With all of this in mind, folks across the upper Northeast are talking about climate migration more and more in the past few years. I'm going to highlight one particular effort that David just mentioned that we were both part of this past year that was called the Northeast Safe and Thriving for All, or NEST project. This was a one-year planning effort funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to consider how socioeconomic and governance factors affect our community's preparedness for demographic changes due to climate impacts. Our team was a truly collaborative effort with both practitioners and academic researchers working together to go beyond traditional climate risk mitigation and instead to explore this emerging issue. As part of our work, we held a full-day event in South Portland in March of this year, where 75 participants from Maine and coastal New Hampshire convened to explore human migration in and around the region and what it may mean for our communities over the coming decades. This event was attended by people representing a truly wide range of sectors, including climate adaptation experts, community planners, nonprofits, state housing authorities, the real estate industry, land conservation organizations, tribal nations, immigrant services, transportation infrastructure experts, and youth. In the coming slides, we'll look more at how climate migration could impact Maine and what we might do to prepare. These coming slides integrate what we learned in this project with other research on climate migration. But perhaps the most important outcome of this past year's effort was that we created this strong network of on-the-ground practitioners working with a handful of academics that are all committed to continue to work together to get additional funding to learn more and to help the region plan for climate migration. So to date, most of the climate migration research has been on the climate migrants, without much consideration of the positive or negative impacts that receiving communities will experience, such as effects on their infrastructure, social cohesion, and economic well-being. Further, the couple of studies that I have found on the ways that climate migration impacts communities is usually focused on communities that take in migrants leaving rapid onset extreme weather events. For example, the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit research organization focused on community well-being, found that migrants who fled hurricanes to cities like Houston and Orlando had no clear impact on the housing market in those cities. In Maine, however, it's likely that much of the incoming migration will be ad hoc rather than planned and spread out over time, suggesting we focus more on the impacts of incremental resettlement. When migration occurs in a dispersed, piecemeal manner, it could create problems that are more similar to sprawl, such as strained infrastructure, encroachment on agricultural and wilderness lands, housing pressures, and a lack of services. It is also difficult to identify clear trends in how climate migration could impact Maine communities because how a receiving community fares is so dependent upon many interacting factors, such as their pre-existing socioeconomic situation, their own climate change impacts, and the migration-related policies they create. We do know that receiving communities can potentially benefit from the economic, social, and cultural contributions new residents bring. For example, in rural areas that experience brain drain with young people leaving, the arrival of migrants can offer the community a rare opportunity to jumpstart revitalization of the area. Yet these communities also face challenges as they welcome folks. For example, much of Maine is experiencing a lack of affordable housing, which could worsen if enough climate migrants move to a particular community. In addition, larger influxes of migrants can stress academic and health services, and long-term residents may also perceive newcomers as competitors for jobs and housing, especially where there was already a shortage. In our own exploration of this topic, we uncovered a few interesting points. First, some of Maine's coastal areas may actually lose households due to sea level rise. While this may not be happening immediately, It will take some planning and preparation to minimize impacts that could include a reduced tax base for the municipality and the cascading associated effects, such as fewer resources available for municipal planning and services, a reduction in amenities that support the broader community, like restaurants and libraries, and a loss of community connection and cohesion and morale. Many Maine cities and towns, however, will likely gain population from climate migration. Again, while the timing and magnitude of such changes are unknown, it will take proactive planning to avoid some of the expected challenges we heard, such as a decrease of available housing in the already tight rental market, an increase in housing prices, which are already becoming unaffordable to many Mainers, stress on infrastructure such as roads, sewer, and water, stress on the natural environment that helps create the places we love, culture clashes, and greater competition for limited services such as public education, healthcare, childcare, and elder care. Across the country, there have been very few policies and programs that have been established to specifically help communities prepare for or respond to the impacts climate migration can bring. However, as I will argue here, most of the suggestions from research and that we uncovered in the past year are actions that will be familiar to communities. Research by the Urban Institute found that networks and relationships that existed across different governmental and non-governmental institutions prior to the arrival of migrants were critical to building the capacity of the community to respond to migration. The reason I really like the suggestion to build partnerships now is that we know that these connections can increase municipal capacity to address all sorts of challenges that arise, not just migration. And it's something that many Maine municipalities already do. Another action that Maine communities can take, perhaps as part of a comprehensive plan update and other visioning exercises, is to decide how they want to position themselves. A rural gateway community that is likely to be a de facto receiving area can discuss what areas of their towns in their future land use plan they want to dedicate to increased housing. A smaller inland rural community may decide it wants to explicitly market itself to be a good place for migrants to settle and have discussions about what type of planning and outreach they can do to encourage that to happen. Regardless of what vision a particular community chooses, by proactively planning, they can take actions now rather than react to what happens. Planners can also prioritize inclusive engagement and knowledge co-production with residents to develop ways to address migration challenges that also address current inequities and climate risks. For example, one small solution Orlando advanced a year after Hurricane Maria was to allow residents in all neighborhoods to build accessory dwelling units on their property to help alleviate the affordable housing shortage and get ahead of migration. Finally, the exciting thing about discussing what we can do in Maine to prepare for climate migration is that even the small study we did in the last year or so came up with many great ideas. While the suggestion to start planning now may feel overwhelming to so many of our towns that are already struggling to address issues that are right in front of them, this list of actions includes plans, policies, and programs that most planners will be familiar with and that can help current residents, from investing in schools to addressing affordable housing and improving broadband access. The list of specific actions is quite long, and some ideas are more appropriate for cities while others for rural communities, but there are plenty of suggestions. Of course, even if these actions are not new, they still take planning, financial investment, and local capacity to carry out. To ask the mostly smaller, underfunded municipalities in Maine to take this on by themselves would be ignoring reality. Thus, it is also important to think about how state and federal entities can assist. Addressing the opportunities and challenges of migration in an era of climate change will demand a multifaceted approach at local, state, national, and even international levels. Perhaps most importantly will be to put climate migration on the federal and state policy agendas so that it gets the attention it deserves at these levels now. There will be financial and technical assistance needs. For example, the federal government could provide rental assistance and incentives for affordable housing in receiving communities to relieve some of the financial pressure on local governments. There can also be government assistance programs to support rural towns' efforts to revitalize their communities and offer incentives for those looking to move. This can include technical assistance to facilitate visioning and planning efforts in potential receiving communities. Such assistance could help receiving communities conduct evaluations of their current capacity to respond to migration, anticipate a range of scenarios, and develop strategies to address them. In our project this past year, we heard this need for assistance. For example, the Maine Governor's Office of Policy Innovation and the Future was highlighted for its successful Community Resilience Partnerships program. A similar effort could incentivize communities to address migration by providing the funding, technical assistance, and networking. We also saw the benefit of collaboration across states in the Upper Northeast in our NEST project. Developing a multi-state regional network could advance action in the climate migration arena. For example, a multi-state collaborative could identify information gaps, bring resources to data collection, identify policy constraints that inhibit equitable adaptation, and advance innovative ideas and approaches to planning for migration that would work in Maine. It shouldn't be a surprise at this point in my presentation that there's much we do not know about climate migration in general, never mind in Maine in particular. While I hope I've conveyed the idea that we can start planning and preparing without the details, and in fact doing so can help our current communities just as much as future ones, it would certainly help our planning if we had more information. For example, it would be helpful to have recent data about the migrants themselves. How many are making it to Maine? And what are the likely trends in movement to Maine over time? Are these migrants mostly coming from internal to the US? Or are some of the international migrants arriving in Maine now moving due to climate impacts in their home countries? What are the demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of future migrants, and how do they differ from today's migrants? And what are the needs of the climate migrants that arrive in Maine? It would also be helpful to have more information about the impacts of climate migration on our receiving communities. Does the piecemeal, unplanned migration impact housing availability and housing costs? How does climate migration affect the school systems, the labor markets, and so on? Finally, it would be especially important to better understand the ways in which different policy actions in receiving communities address the emerging migration-related challenges. Are some types of policies more helpful in legacy cities, while other programs are more beneficial in under-resourced rural towns? Which actions have the greatest support from current communities? Do some programs do a better job at interrupting historical patterns of inequity? It will be imperative to work within communities to identify the most important data gaps and to maintain networks like the NEST project so that these data gaps can be funneled to the organizations and researchers that can help address them. So I hope I've conveyed that we have choices about how we plan and respond to migration. We can be intentional about our preparedness, even in the face of uncertainty. In addition to the multi-scalar efforts already laid out to bolster community preparedness, here are some of the overarching themes that have arisen in the past year. First, we need to acknowledge complexity. Migration impacts and migration responses include an intersection of social, environmental, and economic factors. We need to continue to collect and analyze data across these intersections. We should build and maintain social networks now within and between communities. These connections allow us to more easily share resources, knowledge, and action when faced with challenges. Similarly, we need to break down silos between environmental and other groups like housing, indigenous communities, and youth, and then do intersectional planning together. We need to work on inequities now before they get exacerbated by migration. We need to address existing housing, infrastructure, services, and social inclusion issues for existing residents in order to become welcoming to others. Finally, I suggest that we continue to elevate a more nuanced concept of climate migration onto the broader public agenda in this region. The way we talk about climate migrations, the narratives we use, will shape how we define these challenges going forward and how we respond to them. And that, in turn, provides the context for climate migration policy. We all will need to develop the capacity to engage in difficult emotional conversations around migration and its implications. With that, thank you so much for your attention. I will be happy to take any questions in the time we have. And I also just want to thank this big list that I'm not going to read of people that any one of whom probably could have given this presentation. It was such a joy to work with this great team, and I look forward to continuing to work on climate migrations in this region with this group of people. Thank you again.
So thank you, Vanessa. Fantastic. And it's great to then have everyone see Linda Silka, a senior fellow here at the Mitchell Center. And Linda, I'm going to let you go first, but remember that for those in the room, I'll take questions as they come, and Linda's going to do some of the stuff with the Zoom audience. Take it away.
Thank you. And can everybody hear me? Just hold up your hand if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good, good. The first thing that everyone wants to say is, what a great talk, Vanessa. We learned so much from at all different levels in terms of the information you provided us with. Perhaps a quick question that people have is, how did you get involved and how could we?
Oh, that's a great question. I didn't expect that one. How did I get involved? You know, through networks. I'm a huge proponent of networks. They come up in all the research I do. I used to work at the University of New Hampshire and worked with some folks in their Sea Grant office there and their extension office there. And when one of them heard about this NEST project, that person suggested to the principal investigator at Cornell that they contact me, and one thing led to another, and I got, hooked into it. But how others can get involved, I mean, this is such a new and burgeoning topic that it's ripe for all. I just listed a handful of hundreds of questions that could be explored together. So, contacting myself or David or any of the people that I put on my acknowledgement slide would be a great way to get involved. I've already had a few people reach out to me since this talk was published, just publicized about wanting to collaborate. So that's really awesome and exciting.
It's just so interesting. And one of the messages that you helped us learn and you led us through was really about the interconnected things and how important it is to attend to that. And that really reminded people of, there's this interesting work going on now at UNH on climate change. And what they are really interested in the work that they're doing, and they're now working with people in Alabama, people in California, people in Great Britain, but what they're interested in, their focus is on climate change, but not on migrants. It's on stress on roads. So it's a whole bunch of engineers that are involved, and they're thinking about what's going to happen when we can't get to places anymore because the roads are all falling apart. As you were looking at these different issues and talking about climate migrants and the issues that were going on, did you find that there were some of these groups that were not quite on the same topic that you were, but might be partners? And how would we involve them?
That's a great question. I do feel like climate migration is ripe for that kind of cross-fertilization of folks who are involved in what would normally be disparate topics to come together. I mean, the housing affordability and is just the perfect example of a group that maybe environmentalists don't work with very much, the people who study climate change, but have to be involved in this conversation because of the intersection, as we discussed, of climate migration and housing. And that's everything from people working with the unhoused to people who are realtors who are interested in real estate development and where people are investing their money to, there's all these components related to housing. To plan, to manage retreat, that, there has to be this collaboration. And I think there's just many others. But the second part of your question is really interesting. How do we reach out and get some of the other types of topics and the people who are involved with them to come together? And I think that's one of the one of the places where we have to go to next in this project, which is, and we started to get some of that information in the last year of who else might be involved. And now we have to sort of reach out and say, do you want to work together? Do you see some overlap? Do you guys see overlap in this? So yeah, that's going to be the next step.
Oh, that's really interesting. It really is. Throughout your great talk, at various points, you were talking about some of the mapping that people are doing to capture what's changing, what's going on. Do you, as you were talking about that, and as you're thinking about that, do you see interesting opportunities? For example, a lot of what the tourism in Maine, a lot of times people use maps, think about maps, they see maps. And in a lot of our middle schools and high schools, we hear a lot, students hear a lot about maps. Do you see that at all as a possible avenue we should be thinking about to start to put things there and for people to maybe have a sense of ownership?
I really love that idea. I hadn't really thought about that, but to me, it brings up, all the folks who do participatory mapping and who use maps as a starting point for conversations within communities, because I think you're absolutely right. Maps are these, they can be these boundary objects, these really tangible things we can look at, and everyone gets around in them and starts talking about their places and what they care about. And they're really great ways to start conversations. And in my personal opinion, that's one of the best ways to use maps. What I fear is, even doing this presentation when I have limited time, I fear putting out one person's map and that people will think, well, this is where people are going, when it's just one way to model things and so forth. So that's my only fear with a map, is that people think that if it's there on paper, that's the answer. But as a conversation, as a planning tool, as a way to involve people, I think that's just a marvelous idea.
Great, thank you. I mean, another thing that we all learned and were reminded of by your eloquent descriptions of things is how complex climate migration is, that it's really complex. In your experience, what's the best way to keep people from just throwing up their hands and saying, I can't understand this, there's too much going on? How are there strategies that you've been thinking about that help people take this important, rich information and think about it in complex ways?
Great question. Yeah, I tried to walk that line a little bit today. In fact, I really do think that a lot of the tools we can start with are things we know, and that's helpful. And one of the really interesting things that came up in our NEST project is that there wasn't, even though there's a lot of unknowns, there's also not anything. So there's not some big black box with something so scary behind it that we're just trembling about. Like we kind of know what migration looks like. We kind of know the typical challenges. We kind of have a rich toolbox of planning and policy tools. We definitely have a lot of work to move forward on, but I like to think about that we're not starting from ground zero, that we are, standing on the shoulders of giants, of all these other folks who have made amazing advances in inclusive planning techniques, for example, that, we can build on. And so that's kind of where I go for my hope.
Great.
Hey, Linda, could I take a turn here?
Yes, I was just going to say, I've been hogging things. And
No, that's
David
great.
has some great stuff.
Perfect. I'm going to start first with Francois. Oh, and if you guys can't hear this question, let me know and I'll repeat it.
Sure. Thanks, David. Vanessa, great talk. Lots of fascinating things and a great discussion so far. I was thinking a little bit about that this whole road piece you mentioned, Linda, and the idea that there are these things that we deal with at a different scale than municipal. It's maybe state or even across state lines. And one of those is medical infrastructure, right? And I've heard of some folks who during the COVID uprooted and went and bought some house in Washington County. And then when they got there, they found we don't have any medical support. We're retired, et cetera, or we don't have childcare support. And so there's expectations on the part of migrants that maybe where they're going is going to be like where they came from. And certainly in some areas like the medical infrastructure, it's so diverse and so inequitable. So my question is, how do we reach out to those kinds of groups who are responsible? They're not even really state actors anymore, they're corporate actors or whatever. How do we incorporate those issues into these whole set of discussions of these impacts?
Francois, thank you so much for that great question. And you're absolutely right. You hit the nail on the head. That this is a issue that comes up a lot, that migrants will tend to have certain expectations of services that might be similar to where they came from, and that may or may not be able to be met here in Maine, especially perhaps in the more rural areas. And I think that, the way to address that is partly, like you just hinted at, partnering with, for example, the hospitals or the schools and figuring out messaging and helping educate newcomers about, the best way to navigate the systems here in Maine. And then also, I think having some Maine pride as well for like the things, we do really well, that perhaps, you have to drive further to get to the hospital, but you also go downtown and know half the people you meet, and then find out about something that you didn't know about, and then lend your lawnmower to a neighbor, and the social capital and the networks that you have might be stronger than where the people came from. And so I think there's going to be a little bit of I guess it's a learning curve for newcomers about how things are done, and that's okay. Well, at the same time, figuring out, especially if a community wants to attract people, if they want to be a climate haven, figuring out how they can make that easier? You know, do they need more childcare centers and so forth? What can they do now to start planning for that?
Thank you. That's great. I think I've got two more that I'm going to try and squeeze in before we run out of time. So you have a question, please?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for a wonderful presentation, a very interesting discussion to follow. You mentioned many times that we're working with somewhat insufficient tools to accurately measure climate migration and specifically the number of climate migrants that exist. And so I wondered what needs to change so that we can better fill those data gaps.
Yeah, I think we need to see some changes at multiple levels. So I think there's some data gaps that we might need to see addressed at multi-state or national levels. You know, for example, figuring out how to count international migrants that are coming for climate reasons, or you know, at least partly climate reasons, and that's a whole nother discussion that I'm not an expert in, and I didn't get into today. But that requires a data collection beyond what we would be able to do locally. But I think there's also room for some of the organizations. You know, there's some great nonprofit research organizations, state organizations, and then researchers who are interested in this issue who can start doing research of different types. You know, there's folks who use different techniques to try to identify who's moved to Maine from other zip codes outside of Maine in the last year, maybe working with those and then trying to do surveys and focus groups with the people in Maine to better understand the numbers and needs of those folks. So I'll leave it at that because I know there's one more question to try to get in.
Thanks, Vanessa. And yeah, one more, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I have been listening to the questions about infrastructure and the more heavily inertial bits of society that need to be built up, especially in areas, particularly rural areas that would want to become a climate haven. And one, I think that is kind of overlooked is the industrial part of it, where a lot of industry has built up, especially in the Sun Belt, that would then have to move if that is an area that people would start to migrate from. So my question is mostly around how do you think industry in Maine and the current industries would be affected? Do you think we would see new industries appearing in Maine as, say, manufacturers moved up here? Or would it just be a strengthening of the current industries that are already in Maine and may have experienced a decline, like a resurgence in timber?
Yeah, those are such good questions, and I don't have an answer. I mean, it's really outside of what I study, but I think you're absolutely right that we need that would be something really important to look at, that it's not just households that might be moving, but that we could see potentially shifts in what types of industries are here and how would that affect current industry. And what a great set of questions. I would love to work with someone who does that kind of research to look into that.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Vanessa, that there was a proposal that went out of the University of Maine with many partners about a year and a half ago that was really going to look at a lot of that forest product sector, but in new directions with working forest communities. And it didn't get the 75 million it hoped to get. So some of that hasn't happened yet. But I'd be happy to put you in touch with some of the people who were involved in that. And I think they were doing some very interesting thinking, including with a lot of the equity and justice issues that are also part and parcel of all this work. So very interesting collaboration. I played a small role in it. Vanessa, this has been even more wonderful than I hoped. Thank you for being here today and for doing all this great work. It looks like the sustainability challenges aren't going to go away anytime soon. So you'll have plenty of work for the future to do with students and colleagues and the people of Maine and beyond. So thanks again, Vanessa.